The training hall of the Galactic Defense Academy stretched wide in every direction, like a massive arena built for giants, and the walls were made of some kind of crystal material that caught the light from the twin suns outside and made everything glow with a soft blue color that felt cold and distant to human eyes. And in the center of this enormous space stood Instructor Velthar, with his 4 arms crossed over his chest, in a way that every species in the galaxy recognized as the universal sign of displeasure and contempt, and his body was covered in a hard shell that looked like armor, but was actually his natural skin, and it gleamed under the artificial lights that hung from the ceiling high above, where no human could reach without climbing equipment, and his eyes were not like human eyes at all, but were instead made up of hundreds of tiny lenses that let him see in almost every direction at once. And right now, all of those eyes were focused on the group of students standing at attention before him, waiting for him to speak. And among those students standing in neat rows according to their species and size was one human, and he stood out, not because he was impressive, but because he looked so ordinary compared to the massive warriors and sleek hunters that surrounded him on all sides. The human's name was Jake Morrison, and he was 23 years old, which was young for a soldier in the Galactic Coalition, but not particularly young by human standards, where people often joined the military right out of school, and he had brown hair cut short in the military style and brown eyes that were always watching and taking in details, and he was of average height and average build, which meant that next to the towering Kronar warriors who stood nearly 3 meters tall, he looked like a child, and next to the 6-limbed Vaxil hunters with their lean, muscular frames built for speed and killing, he looked soft and weak and vulnerable, and his uniform was the same gray color as everyone else's, but somehow on him it looked plain and unremarkable, as if the universe itself was trying to make him invisible and forgettable. Instructor Velthar began to speak, and his voice came out as a series of clicks and whistles that the translator devices everyone wore converted into words that each species could understand, and he said that today they would be testing their combat abilities and their reflexes and their ability to think under pressure. And he said these things in a tone that suggested he already knew how everyone would perform, and that there would be no surprises, and as he spoke, he walked back and forth in front of the assembled students like a general inspecting troops before battle, and his 4 arms gestured as he talked, making patterns in the air that emphasized his points and made him seem larger and more important than he already was. Then Velthar stopped walking, and his many eyes fixed on Jake, and he said the human's name out loud so that everyone could hear, and he told Jake to step forward and come to the center of the arena, and Jake did as he was ordered, moving with smooth, steady steps that covered the distance quickly and efficiently, without any wasted motion, and he stopped in the center of the marked circle and stood at attention with his hands at his sides and his back straight, and his eyes forward, and he showed no emotion on his face, even though he could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on him like a physical thing. Velthar circled around Jake, slowly taking his time and making sure everyone could see what he was doing, and he spoke again, saying that humans were new to the Galactic Coalition, and that Earth had only recently been discovered and allowed to join, and that everyone had heard the stories about the human homeworld and how it was classified as a death world, which was a place where everything tried to kill everything else all the time, and where survival was a constant struggle against impossible odds. And Velthar said all of this in a way that made it sound like he did not believe the stories, or at least did not believe they mattered. And he said that today they would see if humans were really as capable as the rumors suggested, or if they were just another weak species that had gotten lucky. Jake stood perfectly still and listened and said nothing, because speaking out of turn during a training exercise was against regulations and would only make things worse, and he had learned a long time ago back on Earth that sometimes the best response to mockery was no response at all, and that people who tried to get a rise out of you usually got bored and moved on if you did not give them what they wanted. And so he waited and breathed steadily and kept his heart rate calm and his muscles relaxed and ready. The instructor moved to a control panel at the edge of the arena, and his 4 hands moved over the buttons and switches with practiced ease, and he said that they would begin with level 3, which was the standard difficulty for second-year students who had been training for months and who understood the basic principles of combat in zero gravity and multi-dimensional environments. And then he paused and looked at Jake, with what might have been amusement showing in the way his antennae twitched, and he said that perhaps they should start with level 1 instead, because it would not do to have the human get hurt on his first real test, and that would be embarrassing for everyone involved. The other students made sounds that the translators interpreted as laughter, and it rippled through the crowd like a wave, and some of the sounds were clicks and some were chirps and some were deep rumbling noises that came from chests larger than any human torso. And Jake heard all of it and felt the mockery behind it. But his face remained calm and neutral, and when Velthar asked him if level 1 would be better, Jake spoke for the first time and his voice was steady and clear, and he said that level 3 would be fine and that he was ready to proceed. Velthar's antennae twitched again, and he made a sound that did not need translation, because contempt sounds the same in every language, and he said very well, and that they would see how long the human lasted, and that perhaps this would teach the coalition why accepting primitive species into their ranks was a mistake that would cost them dearly in the future when real battles needed to be fought, and real enemies needed to be faced, and not just training simulations in safe, controlled environments. The arena began to hum with power, and the holographic projectors built into the floor and walls flickered to life, and within seconds the empty space around Jake filled with obstacles and barriers and cover points that appeared out of nothing, like ghosts becoming solid, and the gravity plates under his feet began to shift and change, making the floor seem to tilt and spin even though it was not actually moving. And threat indicators appeared on the inside of Jake's helmet display, showing him where enemies would appear and what vectors they would use to attack, and a countdown began showing on every screen in the arena, so that everyone could see exactly how long the human would survive. 3 seconds, and Jake shifted his weight and loosened his shoulders. 2 seconds, and his hand moved to the training weapon at his hip, and his fingers wrapped around the grip with familiar ease. 1 second, and Jake Morrison took a deep breath and let it out slowly, and his mind went quiet and still, the way it always did when things were about to get dangerous. 0, and the test began, and the first drone appeared from behind a barrier, moving fast and aggressive, and locked onto the human target that stood alone in the center of the arena, and Instructor Velthar leaned against the control panel already preparing his speech about how humans were not ready for real combat, and how they needed more time and more training before they could be trusted with anything important. And then Jake moved, and everything changed. The first drone never had a chance to complete its attack pattern because Jake's weapon came up smooth and fast, like he had done it 1,000 times before, and the shot hit the drone dead center before it could even finish calculating the best angle to strike from, and the training weapon made a sharp crackling sound that echoed through the arena, and the drone sparked and fell and stopped moving. But Jake was not there anymore, because the moment he fired he was already rolling to the side and moving behind cover that had not been there a second ago, and his body moved with the kind of efficiency that came from training that never stopped, even when the official training was over. Velthar's antennae went stiff with surprise, because that was faster than he expected, and faster than most second-year students could manage, and he watched as 2 more drones appeared at the same time, coming from opposite directions, in a pattern that was designed to split the target's attention and force them into a defensive position where they would have to choose which threat to address first. And most students would panic at this point and try to find cover and hide, but Jake did not do what most students would do. He came up from his role already tracking the second drone and fired twice in rapid succession, and both shots connected with precision that spoke of hours spent on shooting ranges, and both hit center mass where the drone's power core was located, and the drone died in midair and dropped like a stone. But Jake was already spinning toward the third drone, and his weapon barked again, and that drone died too. And all of this happened in the space of 4 seconds, and 3 drones lay broken on the arena floor. The laughter from the assembled students died in their throats and respiratory systems and vocal chambers, and suddenly the only sound in the massive training hall was the hum of the holographic projectors and the soft thud of Jake's boots on the padded floor as he moved to a new position, anticipating the next attack. Velthar stared at his control panel, and his 4 hands hung motionless over the buttons for a long moment, and then he moved quickly and adjusted the settings and increased the difficulty, because clearly level 3 was not enough, and he muttered something about adjusting the parameters, and his hands danced across the controls, bringing the simulation up to level 5, which was normally reserved for students who had been training for a full year and who had proven themselves capable of handling complex tactical situations. The arena responded immediately, and gravity began to shift, pulling from multiple directions at once like invisible hands trying to yank Jake off his feet, and new drones materialized out of the holographic projectors. And these were different from the first ones because they moved in coordinated patterns and used cover and provided suppressive fire for each other, like a real military unit would. And they were faster and smarter and more aggressive. Jake adapted before the simulation finished loading, and when gravity shifted hard to the left, pulling at 3 times the normal force. He did not fight it, but instead used it and let the force carry him into a sliding position that put him behind a barrier, with clean sight lines to 2 drones at once, and his weapon fired and both drones sparked and fell, and he was already moving again, flowing from one position to the next like water finding the path of least resistance. A Kronar student in the front row made a low sound that might have been approval, or might have been shock, and said something in his own language that the translator rendered as by the ancestors he fights like water flows, and several other students made sounds of agreement because they were watching something they had never seen before and did not quite understand. Velthar watched his displays and saw that Jake's heart rate had barely increased and his breathing remained steady and controlled, and there was no panic in his movements and no wasted motion, and every action had a purpose, and every step was placed with perfect awareness of the shifting battlefield. And when a drone appeared directly behind Jake too close for a normal shot, the human did not hesitate, but twisted his body and used his training weapon like a club, and smashed the drone out of the air, and then immediately transitioned back to shooting, positioned to engage the next threat. And all of this happened so fast that most of the watching students did not even see the transition. The instructor's hands moved over the controls again, almost without conscious thought, and he brought the difficulty up to level 7 because he needed to see where the limits were and he needed to understand what he was looking at. And level 7 was the difficulty reserved for final year students who were about to graduate and take command positions in the fleet, and it was not supposed to be possible for a first-year student to handle level 7, and certainly not for a human who had only been in the academy for 3 months. More drones flooded into the arena like a swarm of angry insects, and the gravity began to pulse and shift randomly every 3 seconds, making it impossible to predict which way the pull would come from next, and obstacles began to move, creating a constantly changing environment that required total spatial awareness, and the ambient lighting dimmed, simulating combat in compromised conditions where visibility was limited, and sensors might be damaged. Jake Morrison moved through all of it like he was born to do exactly this, and he used the moving obstacles for cover and the shifting gravity for momentum, and when his weapon's charge pack ran dry, he ejected it with one hand, while his other hand was already reaching for a fresh pack, and the reload happened in less than a second without breaking his stride. And his shots were not just accurate but were placed with tactical intelligence that disabled drones in sequences that prevented them from supporting each other. At the 15-second mark, Velthar realized something that made his mandibles click together in a way that showed confusion and concern, because the human was not just surviving the level 7 simulation, but was dominating it and controlling the engagement and dictating the pace and making the drones react to him instead of the other way around. 20 seconds into the exercise, Jake had cleared the entire scenario and eliminated 30 drones with a 97% accuracy rating, and he stood in the center of the now quiet arena with his weapon held at low ready position and his breathing only slightly elevated, and his eyes still scanning for threats even though the simulation had ended, and the holographic battlefield was dissolving back into nothing. The simulation shut down, and the arena returned to normal, and regular gravity reasserted itself with a gentle thump that most species barely noticed, and Jake saved his weapon with practiced motions and turned to face the instructor, and his expression was still neutral and calm, like he had just finished a routine training exercise and not something that should have been impossible for someone of his rank and experience. He spoke clearly and formally and said, "Permission to return to formation, sir," and his voice showed no pride or arrogance, just a simple request to resume his place among the other students. Velthar stared at him, and all 4 of his arms hung at his sides, and his mandibles worked, but no sound came out because he had no words for what he had just witnessed. And around the arena, students from a dozen different species stood in shocked silence, and a few of the Vaxil hunters had unconsciously dropped into defensive crouches because their predator instincts were telling them that they had just seen something dangerous in deadly move through their territory. Then one student began a slow rhythmic tapping of appendages against armor, and another joined in, and then another, and within seconds the entire assembly had erupted into applause that sounded different for every species but meant the same thing. And the sound echoed off the crystal walls and filled the enormous space with noise that spoke of respect and admiration, and more than a little fear. High above in the observation deck, Commander Petra Hayes watched through the transparent floor and allowed herself a small smile because she had known this would happen eventually, and she had tried to warn the Academy administrators that humans were different, but nobody had believed her reports because they thought she was exaggerating to make her species look good. And now they would have to believe because they had seen it with their own eyes. The Galactic Coalition was about to learn something that Earth's military had known for thousands of years, and that lesson was simple and brutal and undeniable, and it was this: that humans did not just survive on a death world, but thrived there, and that made all the difference in the universe. The observation deck above the training hall had filled with senior instructors and commanders, while Jake was running his demonstration, and word had spread through the Academy's communication network, faster than a ship could jump to hyperspace. And now Commander Hayes found herself surrounded by curious and worried alien officers, who all wanted explanations for what they had just witnessed, and they spoke in a dozen different languages that their translators turned into questions that all meant the same thing, which was, how is this possible? Instructor Kraven was a Vaxil combat specialist whose species held records in 7 different tactical categories, and his 6 eyes remained fixed on Jake down below, who had returned to formation, like nothing extraordinary had happened. And Kraven's voice came out sharp and confused when he said that the performance was statistically impossible because Level 7 scenarios required years of training and neural pathway development that could not be rushed or shortcut, and Jake had only been at the Academy for 3 months. Hayes kept her arms folded and chose her words carefully because she had known this conversation would come eventually. And Earth's admission to the Galactic Coalition had already been controversial enough without making things worse, but there was no hiding what these officers had just seen with their own eyes, and no explaining it away as luck or accident. She asked Kraven what he knew about Earth's surface conditions, and the Vaxil tilted his head in the way his species did when they were thinking, and said that he knew the basic data about high gravity and aggressive fauna and volatile weather patterns, and that Earth was classified as a death world in the official records. Hayes repeated his words back to him with a dry tone and said the basic data. Like those 2 words were not nearly enough to explain anything. And then she began to talk about what Earth was really like, and she said that Jake had grown up in a place called Detroit, which was an urban environment full of millions of humans living close together, and that before he enlisted, Jake had worked in construction and played sports on weekends, and that he was not special forces or genetically enhanced or anything unusual, and that by human standards he was completely average. The observation deck went quiet as the assembled officers processed this information, and Commander Tolvex, who was an older Zephrani, with more experience than most of the instructors combined, clicked his mandibles in a way that suggested he was troubled, and asked if Hayes was really suggesting that all humans had this level of ability. Hayes said not in exactly the same way, because humans varied like any species, and some were better than others, and Jake was better than some, but not as good as others. But yes, these baseline abilities were common among humans because they were survival adaptations that evolution had built into every cell of their bodies. She pulled up a holographic display that showed Earth rotating slowly in the center of the observation deck, and she said that their world was not just dangerous, but was actively trying to kill them every single day. And she explained that a human child could die from falling just a few meters onto a hard surface because their gravity was so strong, and that their atmosphere had enough oxygen to support fire, which meant entire forests could burn and consume everything in their path, and that they had storms that could flatten cities and earthquakes that reshaped continents and winters that could kill an exposed human in minutes. The display changed to show various predators from Earth, and there were lions taking down prey that weighed more than they did, and crocodiles exploding from water to grab animals on the shore, and bears demonstrating strength that could crush bone like paper, and swarms of insects that could strip flesh from a carcass in hours. Hayes continued talking and said that these were just the large threats that humans could see and avoid, but that Earth also had bacteria and viruses invisible to the naked eye that could kill in days, and plants that were poisonous to touch and spiders whose venom caused flesh to rot and die, and that humans had literally evolved in an environment where almost everything was attempting to end their existence at every moment of every day. Tolvex shifted his weight in a way that showed discomfort, and asked if humans had developed technology to protect themselves from all these threats, and Hayes said yes, eventually, but that for most of their evolutionary history, they had survived with nothing except their intelligence, and their endurance and their ability to adapt faster than anything that was trying to kill them. She gestured down toward the training floor where Jake stood, talking quietly with a Kronar student who was asking excited questions, and she said that the human cadet down there had been processing threats since he learned to walk, and that crossing a street on Earth meant judging the speed and distance of vehicles weighing several tons and moving faster than most species could run, and that navigating human social structures meant constantly assessing which situations were safe and which could turn violent in seconds, and that every single day of Jake's life had been training for exactly the kind of scenario they had just watched. Him complete, Hayes pulled up another display, and this one showed comparative reaction times across different species, and the human average sat near the top of the chart significantly faster than most coalition species, and she explained that humans called it situational awareness and that it was why human drivers could navigate traffic at speeds that would overwhelm other species, and why human combat sports were considered extremely dangerous by galactic standards, and why they had been training for scenarios like Level 7 simulations for their entire evolutionary history. She said that to Jake, the exercise they had just watched was probably less stressful than his morning commute to work used to be back on Earth, because at least in the simulation he knew the threats were coming and had a weapon to deal with them. Below them, Velthar had finally recovered enough to dismiss the formation, and the students dispersed in small groups, and most of them moved toward Jake, and their earlier mockery and skepticism had been completely replaced with fascination and respect, and the human seemed surprised by all the attention, but handled it with the same calm competence he had shown during the exercise. Hayes spoke quietly now and said that there was something else the Coalition needed to understand about humans, and that was that they did not just react to threats but hunted them down, and that humans were persistence predators who would chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, and that this refusal to quit was encoded in their genetics at the most fundamental level. She said that the simulation had lasted 20 seconds, but that Jake could have maintained that performance level for hours without significant degradation, because human endurance was built for exactly that kind of sustained effort over long periods. The silence in the observation deck was heavy and uncomfortable, and several instructors were rapidly recalculating their understanding of human capabilities and what it meant for the Coalition's military structure. Kraven spoke first, and his voice was thoughtful when he said that humans had been petitioning for expanded roles in Coalition defense operations, and that most officers had assumed this was just political maneuvering, and Hayes said flatly that it was not maneuvering, but a simple statement of capability, and that yes, humans had specialists who made Jake look slow by comparison. She said that human special operations, forces and pilots and tactical commanders had been training in conditions that would kill most Coalition species just from environmental stress alone, and that the Academy had not seen anything yet. Commander Tolvex's antennae drooped in a gesture that Hayes had learned meant troubled contemplation, and he said that the Council needed to be informed about this capability profile, because there were implications for fleet composition and tactical doctrine and diplomatic relations. Hayes said that she had been sending detailed reports for months, but that nobody read them because they assumed she was exaggerating to make humans look more impressive, and she said that maybe now people would pay attention because they had seen the truth with their own eyes. On the training floor, Jake had been pulled aside by 3 different combat instructors who all wanted to review his performance data, and the young man looked overwhelmed but patient, and he answered their questions with the same steady calm he brought to everything he did. Hayes made a mental note to buy him a drink later because he had just changed the trajectory of human relations with the entire Galactic Coalition, and he probably did not even realize it yet. In the corner of the observation deck, Velthar stood alone reviewing the recording of Jake's performance for the 5th time, and his earlier arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by something that looked like respect mixed with concern. And he had spent 15 years training the Coalition's best warriors, and in 20 seconds a human cadet had demonstrated that everything Velthar thought he understood about combat needed to be reconsidered from the ground up. 3 weeks after Jake's demonstration, the Galactic Defense Academy had quietly restructured its entire combat training program, and Commander Hayes sat in the council briefing room, surrounded by holographic displays that showed revised tactical doctrines and updated species capability profiles, and most significantly, there were requests from 17 different coalition worlds asking for human training advisors and instructors. Admiral Shenkar was an elderly Kronar who served as the Academy's commandant, and his massive claws drummed on the conference table, making a sound like thunder. And he said that Jake had created what his staff was calling a Level 5 diplomatic incident, and his tone suggested he was not entirely displeased about this. Hayes kept her face neutral and said that she was not sure how demonstrating competence in a standard training exercise could be considered a diplomatic incident, and her voice was carefully respectful, but with an edge that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. Shenkar rumbled something that might have been a laugh and told her not to be coy, because she had known exactly what would happen when she allowed Jake to participate in that evaluation, and now half the coalition was terrified of humans, while the other half was trying to recruit them for their own military forces. Hayes said that Jake had volunteered for a standard assessment, and that Instructor Velthar had selected the difficulty parameters, and that humans had simply allowed events to unfold naturally without interference, and Shenkar made a sound that definitely was a laugh this time. One of the holographic displays changed to show Jake in a current training session, but he was not alone or isolated anymore, and instead he was surrounded by students from across the coalition who were all studying his techniques with intense focus and fascination. Liaison Officer Krendal, who was a methodical Centaurian, spoke up and said that the Vaxil hunting clans had formally requested 12 human instructors, and that the Kronar Defense Force wanted 20, and that the Zephrani Tactical Institute had issued an official apology for Velthar's earlier comments and offered a cultural exchange program. Hayes allowed herself a small smile and said that she had noticed Velthar had started attending Jake's training sessions personally, and watching everything the human did with the focus of a student rather than a teacher. Shenkar said that Velthar was not the only one, and pulled up attendance records that showed a dramatic increase in students wanting to train with human instructors, and what had started as curiosity had become a flood of requests and applications. He said that humans had been at the academy for less than a year, and already they were reshaping how the entire coalition thought about combat effectiveness and tactical training. Krendal stood and moved to highlight specific data points on his display, and said it was not just combat where humans were excelling, but across multiple disciplines, and he gave examples of Lieutenant Kate Palmer in engineering, who had revolutionized damage control procedures, and Cadet Ryan Foster in tactical analysis, who consistently outperformed his peers, and Medical Officer Lisa Grant, whose new triage protocols had improved survival rates by 18%. Admiral Shenkar leaned back and his chair creaked under his considerable weight, and he asked Hayes to be completely honest with him about how much Earth's government had understood about human capabilities when they petitioned for coalition membership. Hayes chose her words with great care and said that Earth's military leadership had centuries of experience studying warfare under Deathworld conditions, and that they knew humans were good at certain things, but that they had not known how those skills would translate to galactic standards, and that Jake's performance had confirmed theories that were previously untested. Shenkar repeated the word advantages with a dry tone and said that casually exceeding performance levels that took most species decades to achieve was not an advantage, but a complete paradigm shift that changed everything. He pulled up projected combat effectiveness ratings for mixed units that combined humans with other species, and the numbers showed human reaction times paired with Kronar strength and Vaxil senses enhanced by human tactical awareness, and Zephrani precision guided by human adaptability, and every single combination showed dramatic improvements over single-species units. The Admiral said that the Council was concerned not because humans were dangerous, but because their presence forced a reconsideration of 3 centuries of military doctrine, and that there were political factions arguing that giving humans command positions would destabilize existing power structures. Hayes asked quietly, what Shenkar personally thought about the situation, and the massive Kronar was silent for a long moment while his predatory features remained unreadable. Then he gestured toward the training floor, visible through the transparent wall where Jake was patiently explaining weapon handling techniques to a group of younger students, and his movements were slow and careful as he demonstrated each step. Shenkar said that he believed Jake represented something the Coalition had not seen in living memory, and that it was not a threat, but an opportunity, because the Coalition had been at peace so long that they had forgotten what struggle meant, and humans had not forgotten, because they still fought for survival every day, even in peacetime. He turned to face Hayes directly and said that the Council was going to offer Earth-expanded roles in Coalition defense operations, including command positions and instructor assignments and tactical advisory roles, and that there would be resistance, but the data was undeniable. And humans were natural. Warriors, and the Coalition needed warriors. Hayes felt pride and vindication, but also concern because Earth was still learning galactic politics, and increased military prominence would bring increased scrutiny and potential problems. She asked about the species who were worried about human capabilities, and Krendal made a chirping sound that indicated amusement, and said that they were not concerned about human capabilities, but about not having access to human capabilities, and that every major power was calculating how to secure human partnerships. A chime at the door interrupted the conversation, and Velthar entered carrying data tablets in all four arms, and the Zephrani instructor looked different from the confident officer who had mocked Jake 3 weeks ago, and there was humility in his posture now. He addressed the Admiral formally and said he had completed the comprehensive analysis that had been requested and that the findings were illuminating, and Shenkar told him to summarize. Velthar's antennae twitched as he organized his thoughts, and he said that humans possessed what he termed adaptive combat intelligence, and that they did not just react to threats, but anticipated them based on pattern recognition, developed through constant environmental pressure. He pulled up neural scans showing Jake's brain activity during the assessment, and pointed out that where most species showed stress responses during combat, Jake's neural activity actually decreased, as he entered what human psychologists called a flow state, where trained responses took over from conscious thought. Shenkar asked if this was common among humans, and Velthar confirmed that every human cadet tested showed similar patterns to varying degrees, and that their performance improved under pressure, rather than degrading, which was counterintuitive to everything the Coalition understood about stress physiology. Hayes spoke up and said it was not counterintuitive on Earth, and that humans called it grace under pressure, and that it was the result of millions of years being hunted by predators, and that the humans who panicked did not survive to reproduce, while the ones who stayed calm passed on their genes. The room fell, silent as the implications settled over everyone present, and the Coalition had been built by species from relatively peaceful worlds where cooperation was the primary survival trait, and Earth had added violence to that equation, creating a species that could think and fight equally well. Velthar spoke quietly and said there was one more thing, and that in reviewing the footage he had noticed Jake was not fighting at full capacity, and that his heart rate and breathing and muscle activation all suggested he was operating at approximately 75% of maximum capability. He said that Jake had been holding back deliberately to avoid appearing too far outside normal parameters, and that the human had been trying not to embarrass anyone. Hayes closed her eyes briefly because of course Jake had done that because he was a thoughtful person, trying not to make his hosts uncomfortable while still completing his assigned task. Shenkar said slowly that what they had witnessed, which had already prompted a coalition-wide reevaluation of combat doctrine, had been humans going easy on them, and Hayes confirmed this was likely correct. The Admiral made a sound between a laugh and a growl, and said he would recommend to the Council that Earth take primary responsibility for revising tactical training protocols, and that human instructors be integrated into every major academy, and that humans stop holding back. He stood, and his massive frame dominated the room, and said the galaxy was vast and that they had been fortunate to enjoy peace, but that peace never lasted forever. And when the next threat emerged, he wanted humanity standing beside them, and not behind them, but leading them, because humans had already been to hell and knew the way. 6 months after Jake's demonstration, The Galactic Defense Academy had undergone the most comprehensive restructuring in its 300-year history, and Commander Hayes walked through the main training complex, observing changes that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. In Combat Hall 7, Lieutenant Ryan Foster, who had been a police officer in Chicago before joining the academy, taught advanced threat assessment to 60 students from 12 different species, and his methods were unconventional compared to traditional coalition training because he emphasized instinct and pattern recognition and what he called reading the street. But his students were outperforming their peers by significant margins. In the medical wing, Dr. Lisa Grant had completely redesigned trauma response protocols based on human emergency medicine, and her triage system had reduced mortality rates during training accidents by 23% because humans were very good at stabilizing trauma cases quickly after dealing with car crashes and industrial accidents and sports injuries for thousands of years. In the Tactical Simulation Center, Jake Morrison was no longer a student, but an instructor, and Hayes entered the observation deck to watch him run a Level 9 scenario, which was 3 levels higher than what he had completed during his first assessment. But this time, he was not alone, and instead led a mixed unit of 12 students, including Kronar and Faxel and Zafrani, working together with coordination that would have been impossible. 6 months ago, Admiral Shenkar approached quietly, which was impressive for someone his size, and he said it was beautiful to watch a Kronar providing heavy fire support while a Vaxil scouted ahead with both coordinated by a human tactical leader and 3 species that traditionally did not work well together, now operating like they shared one mind. Hayes watched Jake direct his team through the simulation, with minimal commands because he trusted them to execute without constant supervision, and when a Zafrani student hesitated before a jump that would have been deadly under Earth gravity but was safe under standard conditions, Jake was there immediately, with calm encouragement. She commented that Jake was good with the students, and Shenkar corrected her, saying that Jake understood them, and that this was the real gift humans brought, which was not just combat effectiveness but the ability to teach it, because humans had spent their entire history teaching each other to survive impossible situations. The simulation ended with Jake's team posting the 3rd highest score in Academy history, and the young instructor gathered his students for review, pointing out successes and areas for improvement. In his earlier nervousness around alien species had vanished, replaced by confident professionalism. Shenkar said quietly that the Council had made their decision, and that Earth was being offered full military partnership status, including command positions throughout the Coalition Defense Force, and that the vote had been nearly unanimous. Hayes asked about the nearly part, and Shenkar said the Zafrani delegation had abstained because of old pride and difficulty accepting that their dominance of tactical instruction had been challenged, but that Velthar's testimony about human capabilities had swayed several undecided votes. Velthar entered the observation deck at that moment, carrying data tablets, and he had become one of humanity's biggest advocates, publishing papers that were reshaping coalition tactical theory. He greeted them formally and said he wanted to share the latest assessment results showing that all coalition students were improving, not just those in human-led units, because the new training methods were raising the baseline performance across the board. He displayed comparative data showing reaction times down by 12% and tactical decision making improved by 18% and combat effectiveness ratings up everywhere. And the species training most closely with humans showed the greatest improvements. Velthar said it was fascinating because humans did not just teach techniques, but taught a mindset. And this concept of embracing chaos rather than eliminating it and using stress as fuel instead of fighting it were revolutionary ideas in coalition military philosophy. Hayes said that on Earth they called it staying cool, under fire, and that it was not revolutionary to humans but simply practical. And Velthar replied that this was precisely why humans were effective teachers, because they had naturalized concepts that other species struggled to understand intellectually on. The training floor Jake's class had dispersed, but several students remained asking questions, and the instructor answered each one patiently, sometimes demonstrating techniques, and his earlier isolation had been replaced by easy friendship with students and instructors from across the galaxy. Hayes asked how Jake was handling the pressure of going from ridiculed student to instructor in 6 months, and Shenkar said he was managing well, though he still held back during personal demonstrations. Hayes confirmed this and said that by Earth military standards, Jake was honestly pretty average, and that there were humans significantly faster and more tactical and more capable. Velthar repeated the word average slowly with disbelief in his voice, and asked what an exceptional human would look like. And before Hayes could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the complex. The observation deck's main display activated, showing a coalition patrol ship broadcasting distress from the system's outer rim, and the audio was broken and full of static. But certain words came through clearly, saying unknown hostiles and overwhelming force, and request immediate assistance and casualties mounting. Shenkar was already moving toward the command center with Hayes and Velthar following, and every senior officer in the complex converged on the same location. The command center erupted in controlled chaos as officers tried to understand the fragmentary reports and a patrol ship had encountered something in deep space that attacked without warning or communication, and the ship was heavily damaged with confirmed casualties, and whatever attacked them was still present. Shenkar demanded a status report on available forces and was told that 2 patrol frigates were in dock for maintenance, and the heavy cruiser Phoenix was on exercises in the inner system, with a recall time of 4 hours, and local defense platforms were active, but designed for planetary protection, not force projection. 4 hours was too long because the distressed ship might not survive 4 minutes based on the transmissions. Hayes felt her tactical instincts activate and asked permission to speak, and when granted, she said that 53 human military personnel were currently stationed at the academy, and most were instructors and all were combat veterans, and there were also 900 students, including 200 who had completed advanced training under human instruction. Shenkar asked if she was suggesting they deploy students, and Hayes said she was suggesting they deploy capable personnel, because half those students were better trained than average Coalition Defense Force members had been 6 months ago, and they were already assembled and already working as integrated units. Another burst of static came through, and someone on the distant ship screamed, and then the transmission cut out completely. Shenkar ordered emergency deployment authorization and told Hayes to command the ground element with Jake and Ryan Foster accompanying her, because he wanted experienced human tactical thinking on site, and Velthar would coordinate the mixed species units. Within minutes, the academy transformed from educational institution to active military base, and human instructors moved through halls with practiced efficiency, assembling students and distributing live weapons for the first time. Jake stood in the armory, helping former classmates check their equipment, and his hands moved with automatic precision, and when a Kronar fumbled with an unfamiliar weapon, Jake was there guiding the massive warrior's claws through proper grip technique. He asked quietly if the Kronar was ready, and the alien whose name was Tulrek said he had trained for this, but training was not reality. Jake agreed and said that reality was where humans lived and that they had been teaching everyone how humans survived, and he told Tulrek to trust his training and trust his team because speed and surprise beat size and strength every time. Hayes watched the exchange with pride because 6 months ago, Jake had been the uncertain outsider, and now he was the steady voice preparing aliens for combat with the same calm he brought to everything transport. Ships launched 15 minutes after the initial alert, which would have been impossible for any purely coalition force, and human efficiency, combined with alien capabilities, created response times that shocked everyone as their ship accelerated toward the outer system. Hayes reviewed fragmentary tactical data about the unknown hostiles, which was minimal, just energy signatures that matched no known species, and combat patterns suggesting coordination and intelligence. Jake sat across from her, methodically checking his weapon for the 3rd time, which was a nervous habit to keep his hands busy, while his mind processed the situation. Hayes asked if this was his first real combat, and Jake said yes, and asked if it was hers. She said no, that she had seen action on Earth and outer colonies, but this was different, because this was first contact with an unknown hostile, and nobody knew what they were flying into. Jake looked up from his weapon, and his young face was serious, and he said with respect that they did know one thing for certain. Hayes asked what that was, and Jake smiled slightly and said that whatever was out there had never fought humans before, and